Welcome. My name is Bob Mnookin. I chair the program on negotiation, and I'm thrilled you're all here. Can everyone hear me? Now you can. We're here to celebrate our dear friend Bill Urey. Bill was, of course, a founder of the program on negotiation and has written more books with the word yes, no, or getting in it than one can imagine. But the latest, Getting to Yes with Yourself and other worthy opponents, has just come out, and we are thrilled he's here to talk to us about the book. Bill is one of the most important practitioners of dispute resolution, and someone who, in terms of his writing, has offered prescriptive advice to help people all over the world deal with conflicts more productively. So it's our great pleasure to have Bill here, and all of us at PON are thrilled to include him as part of our family. Bill.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me? Yeah. So it's a huge pleasure to be here today, and really at what's my intellectual home here at the program on negotiation. And I'm really delighted to see so many old friends and colleagues. I was just reflecting, it's been nearly 40 years ago this month that when I was a graduate student here in anthropology on a cold, wintry January evening, and I was in my attic rented room just down the street, and I received a call late at night around 10 p.m. and the voice said, "This is Roger Fisher." And I was very surprised, since I was not in the habit of receiving any calls from professors. And he said, "I've just read your research paper on doing an anthropological study of the Middle East peace negotiations, and I sent the main table to the Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East. And I'd like you to come work with me." And so that was vintage Roger, enthusiastic, generous, positive, and I can say that my life has never been the same since. I had the great privilege a few years later of collaborating with Roger and Bruce Patton on what became Getting to Yes. And that's been my passion, really, for the past 3.5 decades, which is really helping people get to yes in a whole variety of situations, from labor strikes to family feuds to boardroom battles to civil wars around the world. And I seem to have fallen into a specialty of trying to deal with difficult situations, difficult people. And I can see it's not easy for a lot of us to get to yes. Wherever you look, conflict still seems to be a growth industry. People seem to be very busy getting to know in different places, and like in DC, as just one example. And I can really, I think there's probably never been a time when there's probably been a greater need to get to yes in the world than today. And so my question, the kind of question I always ask myself is, what stops us from getting to yes? And so I invite you to think about your life for a moment, and the conflicts that you're possibly, or tensions or difficult conversations that you're involved in, whether it's, and to ask yourself what makes those conflicts hard to resolve. And let me just, if I might, just ask you just a couple of questions just to reflect on for a moment. One is, who do you negotiate with? Defining negotiation very broadly as back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement on some issue, however small. You may have some interests in common and some interests in tension. Who do you negotiate with in the course of your day? Just, in fact, if you wouldn't mind just calling it out, just to see the variety here in the room here, situations. Your 7-year-old son, okay. 86-year-old mother. Okay, we span the generations, right? Colleagues. Who else? Researchers.
My husband.
Your husband. Okay. What's that? Car dealers. Okay. Tenants. Okay. Your doctor. Okay, you just think about that for a moment and just ask yourself another question, which is, if you had to just make a rough estimate of how much of your time you spend engaged, broadly speaking, in that act of back and forth, trying to reach agreement with your children, with your parents, with your doctor, with your colleagues, with tenants, and so on, what would you say it was? If you had to make a rough guess.
Difference of opinion?
Yeah, a difference of opinion, yeah. Or trying to reach agreement with anyone. What percentage of your time do you think it is? What would you say? How many would say it's at least 10% of my time? Okay, start there. Keep your hands up if it's over a quarter. Over 50%? Over 75%? So, it's a huge chunk of our time. We may not always think of it in the formal sense as negotiation, but but in the broader sense of the term, it's a process that we're engaged in from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. And so think just, if you wouldn't mind, just again, pick some situation, any situation in your mind for moments, maybe something you'd want to just think about as we talk over the next hour or so. Pick a conflict or some situation. It might be with your daughter, it might be with your parent or whoever. Just pick a situation and let me ask you one question. When you thought of a problematic situation, how many of you selected, if you think of there being two kinds of negotiations, the ones inside, like inside the family, internal, inside the organization, and then the outside negotiations, whether the car dealer or with clients or customers or suppliers. How many of you, just out of curiosity, when I asked you to pick a difficult situation, picked an internal situation? Okay, how many of you picked an external situation? Obviously, clearly, both can be very difficult, but if I were to ask you what negotiations you generally find most problematic, the external negotiations or the internal ones, what would you say? How many say external, just out of curiosity? Okay, how many say internal? Okay, now look around the room here. It's a huge majority. And I mean, it's a paradox that oftentimes we experience the negotiations that are internal, inside the organization, as the ones that are much more problematic, even though supposedly we're on the same team, working for the same objectives, and so on. Those are the ones that we find, generally speaking, more difficult. And if you look around the world today, even in terms of conflicts, international conflicts, oftentimes the most intractable international conflicts are the internal ones. They're inside, they're civil wars, they're ethnic conflicts, and so on. And so my question is, so that there seems to be that the more internal you go, in many ways, the more problematic it can be. Which leads me to my point, which my question is, what could possibly be more internal as a negotiation than the negotiation we might carry on with ourselves? And this is something I've come to over the years as a gradually increasing realization that, in fact, as I try to help people deal with difficult people in difficult situations, that in fact, the most difficult person we may have to deal with, the biggest obstacle to us getting what we want in a negotiation or in life generally, may in fact not be the difficult person on the other side of the table. It might, in fact, be the person on this side of the table. And as New Yorker Teddy Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt, who was actually a Harvard grad here, once colorfully observed, if you could give a kick in the pants to the person responsible for most of your troubles, you would not sit for a month. The truth is, we tend to get in our own way. Under the stress of conflict, human beings, we tend to be reaction machines. We react very naturally, very understandably, but in ways that often go contrary to our own interests. And as someone who's dealt with a lot of negotiations, negotiation is supposed to be goal-oriented behavior, but oftentimes I find people acting in ways that go exactly contrary to their own interests. And I often ask myself about why. As Ambrose Bierce once quipped, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. So maybe, just maybe, our biggest opponent may in fact be the person that we look at in the mirror every morning. And in that sense, our biggest obstacle can also turn into our biggest opportunity if we can turn this inner opponent into an ally. And that's essentially what I mean when I say getting to yes with yourself. I mean getting out of our own way, turning that inner opponent into an inner ally. Because in effect, what I gradually come to realize is that we've been negotiating, we tend to negotiate with one arm tied behind our back. In other words, we focus all of our attention on just influencing the other, when in fact, maybe the biggest opportunity we have is to influence ourselves first. And my question is, how can we use both arms? How can we free up this other arm? Because as I look at the conflicts that we face these days, we need all the help we can get. So we need to be using both arms. So I've come to understand this question as maybe the missing first half of getting to yes. That's the prerequisite course that I didn't know existed when we wrote Getting to Yes over 30 years ago. Because I find myself just always looking for frontiers where we don't know very much, and this is surely one of them, is looking inside. And in this regard, I want to just acknowledge, there's a lot of pathfinding work already begun in this vein by others, including right here, I look at Erica Fox here, who has written a very insightful book called Winning from Within, which I recommend. Because as I've learned, getting to yes is actually an inside job. So what I'd like to do with you is just talk a little bit about this first and most important negotiation, starting within. And I'd just like to review a couple of key principles right now, and then leave plenty of time for questions. But I'd like to review with you some of the key principles that I've found personally helpful in my own personal and professional experience over the past 3 decades. And as you'll see, they're the very same principles that we use in negotiating with others, but they're applied inward before we turn them outward. I like to think of them as psychological antecedents for the basic principles of getting to yes. As those of you who may be familiar with some of my work, the foundation of this method is to be able to go to the balcony. I use the balcony as a kind of metaphor. It's almost as if you're negotiating on a stage. Part of your mind goes to a mental or emotional balcony overlooking that stage. It's kind of a place of perspective, of calm, of self-control, where you can keep your eyes on the prize. Because that's what I find so difficult in negotiation, is so often our attention gets diverted from what's the main objective that we're actually seeking in that negotiation. A good example today in the world of the internet and email is, you get an email from another department, from a colleague or whatever. You got left out of an important decision, and you're irritated, you're frustrated, you're pissed. So what do? You immediately compose a reply. And you get that instant satisfaction of hitting the reply button, but you don't just hit the reply button, you hit the reply all button. And then it goes out to the entire organization, and then things get complicated. Lots of, the ability to go to the balcony there's a button very seldom used on the screen that says save as draft. That's the balcony button. And if we can learn to, save it as a draft, get it out of our system, and then everyone has their favorite techniques for going to the balcony. It might be to go for a walk, to go for a workout, have tea with a friend, sleep on it, take a breather, whatever it is. You come back, you're going to look at that email, and you're going to ask yourself this question: is this really going to serve my interests? Is this really going to help advance the situation, resolve this dispute, or resolve this situation? And you're going to hit the delete button, and you're going to pick up the phone, call the person, or better yet, get together in person. Just because email, while it's an extremely useful device for communicating information, is not a very useful device when it comes to dealing with anything that's sensitive or emotional. So that would be going to the balcony. Now the thing is while it's the foundation of successful negotiation, both with yourself and others, a lot of people, when I've been teaching this for a long time, and people say, yeah, but it's hard for me to stay on the balcony. It's hard for me to go to the balcony. It's hard for me to stay on the balcony, and I usually fall off the balcony. And so, what do you do? Because, essentially we often get caught in attacking or accommodating out of fear, or avoiding, which doesn't solve the problem. How can we in fact, how can we stay on the balcony? And that's really what I've tried to look into is, and first using myself as a guinea pig, because this work is kind of trying to look inside of what's helpful. And what do you do on the balcony? Well, the first step, it seems to me, is you have to understand your own most worthy opponent, which is yourself. People often, ask me, as I'm sure they ask many of our colleagues here in the field of negotiation, what's the most important skill in negotiation? And usually when I reply, I usually pick, sometimes I pick other ones, but I usually pick, it's the ability to put yourself in the other side's shoes, to be able to understand the other side's interests, their needs, to listen to them. Because after all, negotiation is an exercise in influence. You're trying to change someone else's mind. How can you possibly change their mind if you don't know where their mind is? So I've been teaching that for many years, but as I've often seen, it's not at all easy for people to do, particularly when it comes to conflict situations. It's not easy for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the other, even if it makes sense, even if it advances our interests, it's not easy to do. And so I asked myself, what stops us from putting ourselves in the other side's shoes? And the answer is clear, it's us. The truth is that we're often so busy thinking about our problem, we've got so many thoughts and feelings and emotions going on inside here that we have no mental or emotional space to be able to focus on the other. And who can change that? We can. So what I've come to realize is that there is actually an antecedent step, an essential prior step before putting yourself in their shoes, which is, oddly enough, to put yourself in your own shoes. And that may sound funny because after all, we're not already in our own shoes, but how many of us can honestly say that we truly, truly listen to ourselves in the empathetic way that, say, a good friend might? Because often what I find is that instead of listening to ourselves, we often do the reverse and we have a lot of negative self-talk going on. Our inner critic is very active, never should have done that. I made that mistake. I did that wrong. I won't make it. Psychologists estimate that we have as many as 60,000 thoughts in the course of a day. The majority of them, they estimate to be negative. And as the saying goes, if we talk to our friends the way we talk to ourselves, we wouldn't have any. So the alternative, the psychological antecedent of putting yourself in the other person's shoes is to put yourself in your own shoes. And it starts by learning to observe yourself, to observe your passing thoughts and feelings. As Ben Franklin once advised here in this very city about 2.5 centuries ago, observe all people, yourself most. I'd like to just, if I may, just illustrate this for a moment with an example from my own experience of a particularly challenging negotiation I had some 10, 12 years ago when I was really starting to think about this process of getting to yes with yourself. I was in Venezuela. I'd been invited by President Carter, actually, to see if I could help as a third party between the government of Venezuela and the political opposition. At a time of intense conflict, there were 1 million people on the streets of Caracas demanding the downfall, the resignation of President Hugo Chavez. And there were 1 million people on the streets supporting him, and there was some violence, and international observers were seriously concerned about widespread civil violence, even civil war. And I had a number of meetings. President Chavez was a rather complex and volatile leader, as you may recall, and I had a number of meetings with him, but one meeting in particular I had together with my colleague Francisco Diaz. We had a meeting with him that was scheduled at 9 p.m. at the presidential palace. Well, we waited there very patiently at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight, and finally we're ushered in to see the president, and instead of finding him alone as I expected, he had his entire cabinet arrayed behind him, and he said to me, he gave me a chair, he said, "So, Yuri, what do you think of the situation here in Venezuela?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I've been talking to a few of your government ministers, I've been talking to the opposition, and it seems to me there's some progress." Tried to put a positive face. But that was not what President Chavez wanted to hear, and he said, Progress? What do you mean progress? You're a fool. You third parties are blind. You're naive. And he proceeded to lean very close to my face and proceeded to yell at me for, I would say, approximately 30 minutes, perhaps a little longer. 30 minutes. And so if you put yourself in my shoes for a moment, I'm thinking, wow, 2 years of work down the drain, I'm feeling embarrassed, I'm thinking defensively, what do you mean it's not right? But then I somehow remembered to go to the balcony and say, wait a minute, is this really going to be in my interest to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela? I mean, is that really going to advance the situation, to rebut him in front of all his ministers? And so I just listened, basically. First I had to listen to myself, to all those thoughts and feelings going on in my head, and noticing my physical reactions, just so that I could kind of, by noticing them, by observing them, I was able to let them go. And then some space opened up for me to be able to listen to him, and I just gave him my full attention, listened to him, nodded, and so on. And he was famous for giving 8-hour speeches, and I'm sure that if I had interjected, we could have gone on all night, and that would have been the end of the relationship. But instead, just by listening, and first to myself and to him, then after 30 minutes, just watching his body language, I saw his shoulders sort of sink a little bit, and in a weary tone of voice, he said to me, "So Yuri, what should I do?" That is the sound of a human mind opening. And because before that, for me to try to use any kind of reason with him, he was just absolutely inflamed. But that was my opening. So I said to him, Mr. President, it's December. Last year, Christmas festivities around the country were canceled because of the conflict. Why not just pronounce a truce and say, look, let's have a truce for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, let everyone enjoy the holidays with their family, and then in January we can start again. In other words, let the whole country go to the balcony. And he looked at me and he said, you know what, that's a great idea. I'm going to announce that in my next speech. And his mood had completely shifted. Completely shifted to the extent that he said to me, over Christmas I'm going to travel around the country and I'd like you to come visit with me. He said, you should see the country, you should see this. And then he thought, wait a minute, you're a mediator, you're a neutral. He says, maybe it's not so good for you just to be always in my company. He said, but no worries, I'll give you a disguise. And so essentially, if I think back to a situation like that, and I think, okay, how was I able to stay on the balcony in a situation like that? It's by kind of cultivating, I would call it my inner scientist, my inner anthropologist, which is, anthropologists, we get trained in the method of participant observation. You're a participant and you're an observer at the same time. And what also helped me was I had taken a few minutes when I was waiting in those 3 hours for President Chavez just to kind of clear my mind, quiet my mind. So when he began shouting at me, I had some attention to. I remember, Roger Fisher, when I met him, one of his great kind of teaching points was always, don't just focus on the past, ask yourself the question, what can the parties and what can you do in an international conflict tomorrow morning? What can we do right now to change things? And that was a breath of fresh air for me because I was mostly studying things with professors who were either focused on trying to understand the past, which is important, of course, or they were trying to predict the future. But Roger was always looking for the present opportunity. He was always looking for the present opportunity. And in order to look for that present opportunity in a conflict or in a situation, it requires you yourself to be a little bit present, not to be worried about what someone just said or to worry about what they're not going to say next, but to be in that moment. And that's what I've found to be extremely helpful. So what if before a sensitive meeting or phone call, we could take a single moment just of silence, for example, just to listen to ourselves, clear our minds, focus on what the prize is, what's the intention there. Maybe if we did that, maybe it wouldn't be so hard to listen to others. So the whole point of putting yourself in your shoes, one point is at least is to understand yourself better and uncover what your needs are, figure out what you really want. What is that prize? Now that may seem obvious, but in a lot of the situations I deal with, I find that people don't really know what they really want often. they don't know what they want. And I'll just give you an example just from, not from a political context, but from a business context. About a year and a half ago, I was invited by the wife and daughter of a very prominent Brazilian businessman whose name was Abilio Diniz. And he was the founder with his father of Brazil's largest retailer, and was trapped in a very bitter legal battle with his French partner, who was also a very prominent French businessman, over the control of this retailer. It was an enormous legal dispute. It had gone on for 2.5 years, arbitrations, lawsuits, huge publicity, negative publicity in the press. Who's going to win this? Spending literally millions, if not tens of millions of dollars probably on this dispute. And the Financial Times had called it perhaps the biggest cross-continental boardroom showdown in recent history. And it was extremely stressful to, not just to the parties, but to their families and to the 150,000 employees of the company, and it even had strained a little bit Brazil-French commercial relations. So when I met with Abilio Diniz at his home, I was just kind of listened to a story. I didn't know if I could help. But what became clear to me as I was listening to him is that he wasn't sure what he really wanted. Did he want to continue the fight? He was going to be chairman of the board for another 8 years, and he was then about 76, so until he was 84. And every board meeting was very, very, very contentious. And so, I asked him, Abilio, help me understand here, what do you really want? And he was very clear what he wanted. He gave me a list. He says, I want the stock at a certain price. It's a lot of stock. I want the elimination of the non-compete clause. I want some real estate. He gave me 6 or 7 things. But as I listened, I tried to understand, behind those are positions. What's the interest? What's the need here? I said, Abilio, but help me understand here. You're a billionaire. Is this really how you want to spend the rest of your life? And what do you really want? And so we probed and we talked back and forth for a while, and then he finally said, you know what I want? He says, I want liberdade, which in Portuguese is freedom. That's what I want. I want my freedom. And I said, freedom for what? And he said, freedom to spend time with my family, to pursue my business dreams. I want my freedom. And that was it. I was hearing the human being, not just the champion businessman. And freedom, as I later learned, had a particular resonance from him because he had been kidnapped in a very, very harrowing experience of being kept in a kind of like a coffin for a box for a week until just by chance the police raid were able to find him and rescue him in a hostage negotiation. But so freedom meant a lot to him. And once we were able to get clear about that, then the rest of the process, the negotiation process, why it was challenging, it was very challenging, was surprisingly quick. When I met with my colleague David Lax and I, also from PON, when we met with the representative of the other side, who was the head of the Rothschild family in France at a restaurant in Paris in one September thing, he asked me, he said, so why are you here? I said, because life is too short. That's why I'm here. Life is too short for these kinds of disputes. He said, so how would you settle it? How would you approach it? I said, well, if we can just agree on 2 principles, freedom for both these individuals so they can go on with their lives, and dignity, then I think we might be able to get somewhere. And he said, well, what exactly would that mean in terms of the things? And so he asked me to his office, and we went over just really on one page, really, what were some of the key terms that would tangibly reflect freedom and dignity in this case. And that was on a Tuesday. By Friday, we had both men sitting in a law office in Sao Paulo, shaking hands, signing a 70-page legal document, and press conference, wishing each other well, joint press statement, making a joint address to the executives of the company, and the thing was over. And as Abilio put it to me, he said, I got what I wanted. He was extremely satisfied with the result, but he said, most importantly, I got my life back. So how did he do that? To me, the key there was by getting to yes with himself first, with my help, but he got to yes with himself. He found out what he really wanted. He was able to stay there. Then that's what enabled him to get to yes for the other side. So to me, in your own situation, you may want to think, for example, about see yourself from the balcony, listen to yourself, uncover your needs, and ask yourself, as Abilio, what is it that you really, really, really want in a situation? What's truly important here? What's the equivalent of freedom for you in your situation? It's just, I find that just useful because often just to keep on probing, because it may, you may have an answer at first, but just to keep on probing until you really get down to what is it that you truly want. That to me is like a very useful device. Then, the question is, where does the power come from for us to, to actually meet our needs? In negotiation, we always, we talk about developing your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, the best course of action if you cannot reach agreement. And most people here in the room know that term. It's, it's your walkaway option. It's, if you can't reach agreement with one customer, you may have another customer, one supplier, another supplier. It might be go to court, or ideally find a mediator. What are you going to do if you cannot reach agreement? As my colleague Bob Mnuchin here always talks about, it's in the shadow. Every negotiation takes place in the shadow of something else. That may be your alternative. And so, but one thing I've noticed when I've been teaching this concept over the years is how often people do not do this. I mean, it's amazing to me. I mean, it may seem very obvious to us, in the negotiation field, but people have difficulty doing it. They don't. It doesn't come to them necessarily, naturally. It doesn't come to them it doesn't come easily. It doesn't, somehow, we tend to focus on going for the agreement. We don't necessarily think about what's our BATNA. And I wonder whether or not there's, again, a psychological antecedent to developing your BATNA, which is, I mean, just to give it a name, I would call it your inner BATNA. And by that, what I mean is a psychological commitment we make inside of ourselves to take care of our own needs. Let me just go back to Abilio for a moment. When he told me he wanted freedom, for example, I asked him, okay, Abilio, who can give you the freedom you most want? Who can really give you that freedom? Is it your arch enemy? Or in the end, ultimately, is it yourself? Who can really give you that freedom? Well, once Abilio went through that thought, that analysis inside of himself, he realized, of course, that he himself, to some extent, could give himself that freedom. And once he did that, then he said, okay, well, what can I do to exercise my freedom? I can go take my family on a holiday. I can move my office out of the, I can take other, I became chairman of another company. I can pursue other business deals. He can get on with his life. And paradoxically, once he was able to do that, then psychologically, because he didn't care, he cared, of course, about finding a settlement, or he cared about resolving this dispute, but he didn't care that much that he was psychologically hostage to the other person. That made it easier for him to go through the process of reaching an agreement with his arch opponent. So asking ourselves that same question, which is, who in the end is responsible for meeting my deep psychological needs? Is it really the other side? Is it your spouse? Is it your friends? Are they the ones? Or ultimately, what can you do to meet your own needs independently? There's a kind of self-sufficiency here that allows you psychologically to level the playing field. How can you take care of yourself? Which brings us to the next challenge, which is, just before I do that, I just want, this is kind of a question of power and confidence. And there's one, even in extreme situations, we may have more power within us than we can possibly imagine. And I just wanted to quote a quote from Viktor Frankl, whom many of you know, who was a Viennese psychiatrist who spent years, as you know, in Nazi concentration camps, and who once wrote, "I saw too many people give away their last morsel of food, their last sip of water to others in need, to know that no one can take away the last of our human freedoms, the freedom to choose our own way in whatever the circumstances." And that's the kind of the inner strength that I think that we can bring to bear, the inner BATNA that actually can allow us to develop that outer BATNA. And oftentimes that's, I find, is what's missing. So that brings us to the next challenge, which is how do we change the game? In negotiation we talk about, how do you change the game from an adversarial contest to a collaborative exercise in joint problem solving? And those of us who teach negotiation sometimes illustrate this with an exercise that many of you know, but perhaps some of you don't. And if you don't, maybe I'd invite you just to try it out for just 10 seconds, just so, just to kind of give us a metaphor here. But it's an exercise we call the arm wrestling exercise. So if you turn to your partner and get into arm wrestling position with them, those of you who may not know this exercise, yeah, go ahead. There, I see Susan and Paul doing. Okay, so, now, the goal is very simple. The goal is to maximize your points. So let's imagine that every time you get the other person's arm down, you get 1,000 points, right? Maximize the number of your points. Get ready, get set, go. So I can see this. I can see that either you've done the exercise before, but there's a learning experience that takes place. If you try this out on audiences, you'll find that a lot of people, most people, they start off, it's a stalemate. It's 0-0. Unless you're super strong, you get the other person's arm down once, and you get 1,000 points. But then, as I could see a lot of you were doing here, almost all of you were saying, wait a minute, I want to maximize the number of points. You relax your arm, 1,000 points for you, 1,000 points for me, 1,000 points for you, 1,000 points for me. And pretty soon you're accumulating tens and tens and tens of thousands of points, which illustrates the basic point that perhaps the greatest power we have in negotiation may be, in fact, the power to change the game, because we often approach negotiations, particularly in conflictual situations, like arm wrestles. Who's going to win here? But the question I have is, what stops us from being able to change the game? Why do we so often in conflictual situations, and I've seen people, I teach people, we all teach people, kind of collaborative negotiation, but then when it comes to conflictual situations, people often revert back to kind of win-lose behavior. Why is that? What stops us from being able to change the game, particularly in situations where we're deeply invested? Well, the problem lies in us, of course. We tend to blame it on the other side and say, oh, it's always their fault. But in fact, if we actually look honestly at the situation, the responsibility is also here. It's in our mindset, which is a very natural human mindset that gets triggered, which is a scarcity mindset, a feeling that there's not enough to go around. There's just not enough to go around, that it's a hostile kind of dog-eat-dog world. Now, of course, there may be some truth in that, but a lot of it is what perception, what frame we bring to that situation. And that's why, in the wake of World War II and the advent of nuclear weapons, maybe the greatest mind of the 20th century, Albert Einstein here, posed what he believed was the most important question for each of us. And that was, is the universe a friendly place? This is the first and most basic question all people must answer for themselves. Now, why would Einstein be asking a question like that? Because he reasoned, his reasoning was that if we see the universe as basically hostile, we're naturally going to treat others as enemies. On a collective level, we're going to arm ourselves to the teeth and react at the first provocation. And given the weapons of mass destruction at our disposal, we'll eventually destroy ourselves as well as all life on Earth. But if we can see the universe as friendly, even in adverse conditions, then we're more likely to treat each other as potential partners. We're more likely to get to yes, even in difficult situations. So the question is, how do you change your mindset? How do you change that inner mindset? Not so easy to do. In negotiation, we talk a lot about, reframing. One of your greatest powers is to bring the frame, it's a technique for refocusing attention, for shaping the narrative from adversarial to collaborative. But what I've found is that actually that process of reframing actually needs to start inside of us. We need to learn to reframe our inner picture, that there's a psychological antecedent to reframing. And as Einstein points out, it's a decision, it's a choice. We can make that choice. How are we going to choose to reframe our inner picture? Are we going to see as scarce, or are we going to see somehow that there's sufficiency? And we're asking ourselves the question, where does your essential satisfaction come from? Is it only from outside, or does some of it actually come from inside? Are we capable of manufacturing, our own satisfaction? Is there enough? Can you come to see life as being fundamentally on your side? Ultimately, as Einstein points out, it's our decision, our choice on how we want to answer that question. And that can make all the difference. So, let me just sum up then for a moment so we can get on to some questions and answers here. But just to sum up, if we're able to do this, kind of make these choices and do this inner homework, if we can go to the balcony, learn to observe ourselves, if we can put ourselves in our shoes, our own shoes, and learn to listen to ourselves, uncover our deepest needs, if we can develop our inner BATNA, if we can reframe our picture from scarcity to sufficiency, then I find, at least my hypothesis, is that we're going to find it a lot easier in our daily interactions to change the game from a win-lose situation to a mutual gains one. We're going to be able to, for example, stay, what athletes call the zone, what sometimes psychologists call the state of flow, a place where we're at our highest peak performance in difficult situations. That's a place of presence. We're going to be able to respect the other, even if at first they don't respect us, as I sought to do with President Chavez. We're going to be able to cooperate first, to start off by cooperating rather than starting off by defecting, in the prisoner's dilemma game. We're going to be able to do that even in the face sometimes of uncooperative behavior. And by doing that, oftentimes we're going to give us a better chance to change the game, to basically turn that inner yes into an outer yes. And what that does is it gives us potentially, 3 wins. It gives us a win inside of ourselves, some in the form of inner satisfaction. It gives us a win with the other side, classic, kind of win-win, possibly, at least not a lose-lose. And ideally, it goes even further because getting to yes with ourselves helps us develop a more generous perspective that benefits everyone around us, including in our families, our workplaces, and the larger world. And so let me just end, if I may, with a story from the Civil War. In the waning year of the Civil War, the waning months of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln in the White House was giving a lot of thought to how to bind the wounds of the nation afterwards. And he started to speak sympathetically about the South. And that was extremely difficult for a number of Yankee patriots to hear his kind of sympathetic words about the South. And at one point, when he was giving a talk in the White House, there was a Yankee patriot who took him to task and said, "Mr. President, how dare you talk kindly of our enemies when you ought to be thinking of destroying them?" And Lincoln, in his characteristic way, sort of paused for a moment, and he said, "Madam, do I not destroy my enemy when I turn them into my friends?" Well, that's The truth is that there's very little in life that we can fully control. But one thing that we do have under control is the choice between whether we say yes or no. In other words, whether we say yes to ourselves, put ourselves in our own shoes, develop our inner BATNA, become our own best allies rather than our worst opponents. We can choose to say yes to life, for example, and to see it as our friend rather than a foe. And we can choose to say yes to others, seeing them as potential partners rather than as implacable adversaries. And in my experience, those choices that we make all the difference in us being able to win perhaps the most important game of all, which is the game of life. Thank you.